Hi, I'm Rachel Gravning, and I'm doing my presentation on Where Are the Children? So everyone knows children have always been a part of history. Of course, we were all children once, but they're rarely mentioned in discussions of history. So with this timeline, I intend to reflect on where the children are when we look at Irish history. This timeline was made with the courteous assistance of several museums who sent me what they could on information on children in Ireland, and thanks to connections by Magella McAllister. Of course, there's theoretically an infinite number of these artifacts somewhere out there, making this an ongoing project that will be passed off and added onto for years to come. So about me. Hi, I'm Rachel Gravning, and as I'm sure my accent is given away, I'm from the United States, specifically Seattle, about 7,306 kilometers away. So what am I doing in Dublin working for the Museum of Childhood? Well, I go to University of Oregon, where I'm a major in history and do some work on an archaeological project for a professor. And one day I was in class, and since my university puts a lot of emphasis on students doing study abroad programs, I decided to look through the website. There, I saw that there was an opportunity to do an internship in Ireland, and I signed up on the spot. Later that year, I was put in contact with and placed at the Museum of Childhood Ireland, Museum Oigan that Éireann, something I was very excited about. After coming here, Magella McAllister helped me brainstorm what to research, gave me some ideas, and eventually we landed on the question, where are the children? So what I did. When starting this project, one thing I did was go to museums to see what I could find. One I went to was the National Museum of Ireland. There I found a Viking sword and some Viking games which I took pictures of. And most of these photos in the presentation were taken by me on my research journey, which also somewhat happened to be my travel photos, but not all. For example, the lovely photo on the title card is from the UCD Folklore Collection, which has a great deal more and is worth checking out later. Later, I was put in contact with the museum, and they told me about two more items, a doll from 1735 and a wooden boat in the prehistory section. The museum was massively helpful in getting this information. From there, I started visiting and contacting other museums, which people at the Museum of Childhood Ireland helped me get in contact with, including Dr. Eimear O'Connor, who was a huge help to this project. So without further ado, here are some of the things I found. So, starting in 1795 AD, Vikings began to occupy Ireland, creating settlements, the most famous one being Dublin. And according to a paper by archaeologist Anders Hoberg, historical evidence of play is often done in reflection of adult life. For example, the small Viking wooden sword that has been identified as for children serves a purpose beyond just entertainment. It also allows children to start cultivating the skill of sword fighting before it becomes necessary in their adulthood. One of the reasons that it can be difficult to identify evidence of childhood is that it can be difficult to distinguish between a tool being smaller, a model of it, or an item actually intended for children. There's also the fact that children have always been involved in labor, specifically around family farms where many of children's activities, not counting things like combat, which would be only for adults, are simply the same as adult activities. Well, the sword has been able to be identified as belonging specifically to children, because as I mentioned, if you're that young, you likely wouldn't be involved in some of the more combat aspects of Viking life. But there's many instances of objects that are just like smaller buckets, where it's possible it was for a child's work on a farm, because while they were working on a farm, a child still could not carry as much as an adult. But it could have also just served another purpose, like for an adult to carry something that requires a smaller bucket. Part of the difficulty with finding evidence of childhood is that childhood can at times be almost archaeologically indistinguishable from adulthood, as it's almost always in preparation for or already participating in it. And this is pretty clear with the Vikings. Games were also something very important to the Viking era. Although these are not isolated to children, as adults would have also played with them very frequently, board games were something very commonly enjoyed amongst Vikings. One of the very common ones was a game spelled Hnefatafl, which I don't think I can pronounce, but it's a chess-like game where the ultimate goal is to get a king piece to the other side of the board, where you have other pieces around it that you use to guard it. So yeah, very similar to chess or checkers, as we know. Another was something resembling spinning tops, as seen in the photo here. I'm not entirely sure if they were used as spinning tops, but they physically do resemble it. There were also some Greco-Roman inspired games involving dice, and an unknown game involving a pin board, where all we really have is the board, so we don't exactly know the rules and process of the game, but one can assume that it had something to involve putting pins inside of the board. This is another example where it's not really direct evidence of childhood, as adult Vikings absolutely partook in this sorts of entertainment. However, it is just as likely that children played it as well. Once again, childhood becomes more of a reflective preparation for adult life than entirely its own sphere. It was not only play involving imitation of adult work, but these hobbies just being roughly the same throughout the entire life of a person. The Viking era was also one of the wealthiest times in Irish history, where adults and children alike had the time and money for materials intended for play, and these materials were able to last a significant portion of time, and as they were specifically intended for play, they were able to be identified as this is what they were for. Versus if you move into poorer areas of history, a lot of times children would play with whatever they could get their hands on, whether it be like corn husks or just rocks or whatever, and those can't really be as easily identified as items for play. So when you're at wealthier points in history, it does become easier to make this distinction. So medieval Ireland. Most of the evidence of children from medieval Ireland comes from burials, and I could not really find any evidence from this time that wasn't grave sites. When moving into the medieval era, Christianity becomes a large factor in all of life when it comes to relation to children and baptism, in particular because Catholic burial grounds were only allowed to be occupied by people who have been baptized. So this led to a question of what to do with children who died in infancy, stillbirth, or simply were never baptized because they were just too young and the parents hadn't done it yet. So this is where we get to Killiney. Killiney was the name for burial grounds of unbaptized children, and that they were created so that the parents of those children could mourn with a proper funeral without violating Catholic burial law. The Killiney is strongly tied with the adult perception of childhood. As stated by Dr. Eileen Murphy, a member of the Museum of Childhood Ireland, in her book Children, Death, Burial, Archaeological Discourses, the remains of dead children are manipulated within an adult world. And this aspect of childhood is really clear through Killiney, because this is the aspect that is through the lens of adulthood. In terms of location, by far the most Killiney have been found in Galway, was the second most in Kerry, with about 500 and 200 Killiney respectively. Renee Boyle, an expert in Killiney and the one who has taken these lovely photos, has informed me that some of them were still in use up to the 60s and 70s on the Arshil and Currane Peninsula. Also, what is particularly touching is that you can see the writing on this particular one on the right looks somewhat modern. So there still is, as mentioned by the fact that they were still in use up to the 60s and 70s, some modern remembrance going on here. Because someone still clearly made sure to write the name on this gravestone. So here we actually go earlier in the timeline to the Coin Adam Yoin. It was signed around the year 697 AD and is also called the Law of the Innocents. The document is not direct evidence of what a childhood would be and what children would do with their lives, but it is about children, because the law increases penalties for killing women, children, and monks in times of war. This was spoken about at the Seen and Heard event put on by the Museum of Childhood Ireland in Birr Library, where the Coin Adam Yoin remains displayed on the upper floor for anyone to see if they wish. And once again, we run into issue where evidence of childhood does not really listen to the voice or life of the child, but instead the adult interaction with it. It does show that adults at this time period were considering the lives of children valuable because, of course, and found that the commonality of violence made it necessary for legal protections. But it does tell us very little about what the experience of childhood was at the time, since it's still fundamentally an adult perspective on it. And this is, as I mentioned, something that is really common when you start looking at evidence of childhood. Most of it is going to be through the adult perspective on childhood. And something similar as my associate Campbell mentioned in her video a lot about child labor in Ireland, and a lot of child labor laws also kind of still come from the perspective of adults. There's a lot of importance in protecting children's rights, but also historically it's very interesting because it's still very rarely the child's voice that is represented in children's history. But yes, fantastic video also on child labor rights. You should absolutely go watch that. Glasnevin Cemetery. Glasnevin is a very famous cemetery, partially because neither status nor religion prevented one from being buried there. But the very first person to be buried there was actually an 11-year-old boy named Michael Carey, who passed away due to tuberculosis. As you can see a little bit in the photo of the sign I took while I was there are very few children actually buried within the cemetery. However, especially considering the very first person was a child, I think connecting with Glasnevin is a great place to take this project in the future. And I think it's also possible that the reason the percentages are so much like this is because it's somewhat has to do with finances, as it's quite expensive to be buried, especially in such a famous cemetery, but also because it's a historical cemetery, so it's where a lot of people who are considered to be very influential figures in Irish history are buried. And as a result, a lot of children don't really meet that mark. And while it may not necessarily be true that children don't have a place of belonging, because I think there are absolutely some very possibly influential children in history, same way a lot of women were not originally considered to be influential figures in history, and then we later look back and realize there were a lot. So I think maybe looking at that lens could also be a very interesting place to take something like this in the future. Conclusion. This remains an ongoing project, as I just mentioned. Oh, sorry, real quick. For the past one, I have recently gotten in contact with Glasnevin. Super helpful. And this is definitely going to be added to the timeline in the future. And this is an ongoing project. And as I was talking about, and it's not quite finished, as it's very difficult to find evidence of childhood throughout Irish history for the reasons discussed in the presentation. And it's generally not regarded in that high of importance, but there's also the issue of it being archaeologically difficult to tell the difference between childhood and adulthood. And this leads to the next part of this. Many of you probably know things about historical childhood and even your own childhoods that I couldn't find. And while this is currently an online presentation and it's not the in-person one, I would still like to invite you to find some way to share this with the Museum of Childhood Ireland. We have contact pages, and we would love to hear about your childhoods, including what childhood is like in 2025. Because even if we do manage to find every piece of evidence throughout Irish history, not that that's possible, huge history, lots of children, but time really never stops marching, and this project will always keep growing. So skip the Q&A section because this is virtuals. But yeah, thank you. that's my project, and I hope you enjoyed.